It doesn't happen all at once. That's what makes it so disorienting. There is no single moment, no clean break, no argument that ends it. Just a slow, creeping realization that the conversations don't reach you the way they used to. That you're performing interest in things you've stopped caring about. That you sit among people you love, people who have known you for years, and feel underneath the warmth a strange and lonely distance, as though you're speaking to them across a widening gap that only you can see. You've changed, and they haven't. Or they've changed in a different direction, and the shared world that once held you together has quietly stopped existing. Nobody prepares you for this particular grief. We have language for the loss that comes from conflict, from betrayal, from people leaving. But this is a loss that comes from growth, from becoming more yourself, not less. And it feels like a betrayal, even though no one did anything wrong. You didn't stop loving them. They didn't stop loving you. You simply outgrew the version of yourself that fit among them, and in doing so, you lost the belonging that version made possible. And there is no one to blame, which somehow makes it lonelier. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this grief better than almost anyone who ever wrote. He understood it because he lived it, increasingly isolated, misunderstood, separated from nearly everyone by the very intensity of his own becoming. And he built, out of that isolation, a philosophy that does something almost no one else does with this experience. It refuses to treat it as a tragedy. It treats it as the price, the necessary, unavoidable price of becoming who you actually are. Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher who has become one of the most influential and most misunderstood thinkers in the history of Western thought. He wrote about morality, meaning, power, art, and the death of God. But beneath all of his specific concerns ran a single consuming preoccupation: the question of how a human being becomes what they truly are, not what they were told to be, not what the crowd around them rewarded them for being, but the fullest, most authentic version of themselves, achieved through a difficult process he returned to again and again under different names. Nietzsche's own life was a study in isolation. He was a brilliant young professor who walked away from academic respectability. He spent years wandering alone through the mountains and coastal towns of Europe, writing books that almost no one read during his lifetime. He was estranged from friends, from the culture around him, from nearly every form of belonging available to a person of his time. And out of that profound solitude, he produced a body of work obsessed with the relationship between becoming yourself and standing apart from others. His central conviction was this: most people never become individuals at all. They remain, their whole lives, members of what he called the herd, moving with the crowd, absorbing the values of those around them, taking their beliefs and their sense of right and wrong ready-made from the collective, never questioning, never separating, never discovering what they might have been if they had dared to think and live for themselves. The herd is comfortable. It offers belonging, safety, the warmth of shared assumptions. But the price of that comfort, in Nietzsche's view, is the self. To remain in the herd is to never become an individual. And here is the part that speaks directly to the grief in this title. Nietzsche understood that the movement out of the herd, the process of becoming an individual, is necessarily isolating. You cannot grow beyond the collective while remaining fully inside it. The very act of becoming yourself creates distance between you and those who have not undertaken the same becoming. The loneliness you feel when you outgrow the people around you is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign, Nietzsche would say, that something is finally going right, and that it costs exactly what he always said it would. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. To understand why growth isolates, you have to understand what Nietzsche meant by becoming yourself, because he did not mean simply discovering some fixed identity that was there all along. He meant something far more demanding. He called it self-overcoming, and it was, for him, the essential activity of a living human being. To be alive, in Nietzsche's sense, is to continually surpass what you have been, to overcome your former self, again and again, in a perpetual movement toward something higher. Life itself, he wrote, is that which must overcome itself. This means that becoming who you are is not a destination, but a process, and a violent one. It requires the repeated death of former versions of yourself. The person you were last year, the beliefs you held, the comforts you relied on. Self-overcoming demands that you leave them behind when you have grown beyond them, even when leaving hurts, even when what you're leaving behind includes the version of you that belonged among certain people. Nietzsche wrote that you must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame, that you cannot become new without first becoming ashes. Growth, real growth, is a kind of self-immolation. And the self that burns away often includes the self that fit. In his masterwork, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche described this process through an image of 3 metamorphoses of the spirit, 3 stages a person passes through in becoming themselves. First, the spirit becomes a camel, which kneels down and takes on the heavy load of everything it is told it should carry. The duties, the values, the expectations handed down by the culture and the people around it. The camel is the obedient self, the self that bears what it is given. Then, in the second metamorphosis, the camel travels into the desert and becomes a lion. The lion's task is to fight the great dragon whose name is Thou Shalt. To say no to the imposed values, to tear apart the sense of obligation to be what others demand, to win the freedom to become oneself. The lion is the self that separates, that refuses, that breaks from the herd. And this second stage, the lion, is where the grief lives. Because to become the lion is to say no to much of what bound you to the people around you. The shared values, the common assumptions, the agreed-upon way of seeing the world. The lion must reject the parts of these that are merely inherited, merely borrowed, merely the herd speaking through you. And in doing so, the lion becomes solitary. It has left the caravan. It stands alone in the desert, having won its freedom at the cost of its belonging. This is the loneliness of the person who has outgrown their world, the necessary isolation of the one who has begun to say no to what everyone around them still says yes to. The third metamorphosis, the child, comes later. A new innocence, a capacity to create new values and affirm life freshly from one's own center. But you cannot reach the child without passing through the lion. You cannot create a new belonging without first enduring the loss of the old. The grief is not a detour from the path. It is the path. Nietzsche had a phrase for the space that opens up between a person who is becoming themselves and those who remain in the collective. He called it the pathos of distance, the felt sense of separation, of rank, of difference that emerges as an individual rises out of the mass. It is not contempt, though it is often mistaken for contempt by others and sometimes by oneself. It is simply the recognition of a real gap, the growing distance between where you are becoming and where the crowd remains. This distance is painful in a way Nietzsche did not shy away from, but he insisted it was necessary. The individual who is becoming themselves cannot pretend the distance isn't there. To collapse it, to shrink yourself back down, to unknow what you've come to know, to pretend you still fit where you no longer fit, is to betray the becoming. And yet the pull to do exactly that is enormous, because the distance is lonely, and human beings are made for belonging. The temptation to return to the herd, to trade the self back for the comfort of fitting in, is one of the central temptations of a growing life. Nietzsche was also clear-eyed about something that makes this grief even harder. The herd does not always let you go gracefully. Those who remain in the collective often experience the person who is growing beyond it as a kind of threat or a kind of accusation. Your growth, simply by existing, calls into question the choices of those who have not grown. And this can provoke a reaction Nietzsche understood deeply, what he called ressentiment, the resentment of those who feel diminished by another's ascent, and who would rather pull that person back down than confront what their rise reveals about their own stagnation. This is why outgrowing people so often comes with a specific and confusing pain. It is not only that you feel distant from them, it is that some of them may begin to resent you for it, to subtly punish you for changing, to accuse you of thinking you're better, of abandoning them, of becoming someone they no longer recognize and did not give permission to emerge. You may find that the people who once supported you become cool, or critical, or quietly hostile, precisely as you begin to flourish. Nietzsche would tell you this is not a sign you've done something wrong. It is the herd's predictable response to the one who leaves it. The crowd rarely applauds the person who walks away from it. And so the grief doubles. You lose the belonging, and you may also lose the goodwill. Finding that becoming yourself is treated not as an achievement, but as a betrayal by the very people you outgrew. This is perhaps the loneliest part of the whole process. But Nietzsche's philosophy exists precisely to help you bear it without turning back. There is a further cruelty buried in this that Nietzsche understood with particular sharpness. Often the people you outgrow are not strangers or casual acquaintances. They are the ones who knew you first. The family, the oldest friends, the people who were present for the earlier versions of you, and who, in some sense, feel they have a claim on who you are. And this makes the distance harder, because these are the relationships that carry the most history, the most love, the most weight. To feel yourself drifting from a stranger costs nothing. To feel yourself drifting from someone who held you as a child, who was there before you became whoever you're becoming, who represents home in the deepest sense, that is a grief that reaches all the way down. Nietzsche did not pretend otherwise. He knew that the people we outgrow are frequently the people we love most, and that this is precisely what gives the process its particular anguish. The herd, in his language, is not a crowd of faceless others. It is often made of the faces you love best. That is why leaving it is not triumphant but mournful, even when it is necessary. And yet he would insist on the necessity. Because the alternative, to stay small enough to keep fitting, to refuse your own growth out of loyalty to people who cannot follow you, is not love. It is a slow self-erasure dressed up as devotion. The person who refuses to become themselves in order to preserve a belonging they've outgrown does not actually preserve the relationship. They preserve a performance, and they lose themselves inside it. Nietzsche saw this clearly. The kindest thing, in the end, is not to shrink. It is to grow, to grieve honestly what growth costs, and to let the people you love find their own way toward you. Or not without holding your own becoming hostage to their comfort. Nietzsche did not offer comfort in the ordinary sense, and he would have been suspicious of any philosophy that made this process painless. But his work points toward a way of carrying this grief that neither denies it nor lets it pull you back into a self you've outgrown. The first movement is to stop interpreting the loneliness as a mistake. The instinct, when you feel the distance opening between yourself and the people around you, is to read it as evidence that you've gone wrong, that you've become cold or arrogant, or that you've lost something you should fight to recover. Nietzsche's framework offers a radically different reading. The distance is the evidence of your becoming. The loneliness is the sensation of growth, not the sign of failure. When you feel it, the task is not to eliminate it, but to recognize it for what it is. The necessary companion of anyone who is actually becoming an individual, rather than remaining a member of the herd. This reframe does not remove the pain, but it changes its meaning entirely. What felt like something breaking is revealed as something being born. The second movement is to resist the temptation to shrink back, the pull to collapse the distance, to dim yourself, to readopt the values you've outgrown, to perform the old version of yourself so you can keep the old belonging, is powerful and constant. Nietzsche would name this the great danger of the growing spirit, the seduction of comfort, the longing to return to the caravan and lay back down as the camel. To bear the grief without betraying yourself is to feel the loneliness fully, and still refuse to purchase relief from it at the price of your own becoming. This is not coldness toward the people you're outgrowing. You can love them and still not return to who you were for their sake. The refusal is not of them. It is of the self-betrayal that going back would require. The third movement is to seek not the herd, but genuine companions, what Nietzsche called fellow creators. He drew a sharp distinction between the belonging of the herd and a rarer, higher kind of connection, the bond between individuals who are each engaged in their own becoming. Zarathustra, in Nietzsche's telling, does not want followers or believers. He seeks companions who create, who walk their own paths, who can meet him not in shared conformity, but in shared aspiration. The grief of outgrowing your world is real, but it is not a sentence to permanent isolation. It is a transition, from a belonging based on staying the same together to a belonging based on growing separately and together toward something higher. These companions are rarer and harder to find than the easy belonging of the herd, but the connection they offer is one the herd could never provide. The fourth movement is amor fati, the love of one's fate. This was, for Nietzsche, the highest formula for a life well lived. It means not merely accepting what your becoming has cost you, but coming, eventually, to affirm it. To say yes to the whole of your path, including the losses, including the loneliness, including the people you outgrew, and the belonging you had to leave behind. Not because those losses didn't hurt, but because they were inseparable from the becoming that made you who you are. To love your fate is to reach the point where you would not trade the difficult, isolating truth of your own growth for the comfortable falsehood of a self you'd left behind. It is the final transformation of grief, not into numbness, but into a fierce and clear-eyed affirmation of the life that grief was the price of. There is a loneliness that comes from having no one, and there is a different loneliness that comes from becoming someone. And the second is the one Nietzsche spent his life trying to make bearable. Because he knew, from the inside, that the path toward becoming who you are leads through territory where the old belonging cannot follow. That growth, real growth, is a kind of leaving. And that the grief of outgrowing the people and the world that once held you is not a malfunction of the process, but an intrinsic feature of it. the shadow cast by the light of your own becoming. He would not tell you this grief is small, or that it doesn't matter, or that you'll simply get over it. He took loss seriously, having lived so much of it. What he would tell you is that the grief means something, that the distance you feel is the measure of how far you've come, that the loneliness is the honest sensation of a person who has chosen to become themselves rather than remain a comfortable fragment of the crowd, and that this choice, though it costs you the easy belonging you once had, gives you something the herd can never offer, the possibility of actually becoming who you are rather than dissolving forever into who everyone around you expected you to be. You are not wrong for having grown. You are not cruel for having changed. You are not required to shrink back into a smaller self so that others can remain comfortable in theirs. The quiet grief you feel is the grief of individuation, the grief of self-overcoming, the grief of the lion who has walked into the desert to win the freedom to become. It is real, and it is heavy, and it is also the surest sign that you are alive in the way Nietzsche believed a human being was meant to be alive. Becoming, always becoming, even when becoming means walking, for a while, alone. The people you have outgrown are not your enemies, and the belonging you have lost was not nothing. Honor it, grieve it, and then keep walking. Because somewhere ahead of you, past the desert of this particular loneliness, are the companions you have not yet met, the ones who are also becoming, also grieving, also walking alone toward something higher. They are looking for you too, and you will only find them on the far side of the courage it takes to keep becoming who you are.